Venezuela's sub-gamble backfired fast and the world isn't paying enough attention. Let me take you back to July 31, 2024, a date that, on the surface, looked like just another routine diplomatic spat in a region the US has long treated as its backyard. That was the day Venezuela's Navy, in a move that stunned even seasoned Latin America watchers, intercepted and boarded a Guyanese-flagged oil research vessel operating in waters claimed by both countries. The official story? A simple enforcement of sovereignty. The reality? A high-stakes gamble that has already spiraled into one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the Western Hemisphere, with implications far beyond the Caribbean. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of energy geopolitics and great power competition, and I can tell you what's unfolding in the Essequibo dispute isn't just about a 61,000 square mile patch of jungle and offshore oil fields. It's about the unraveling of American hegemony in its own neighborhood, the reckless overreach of a desperate regime, and the quiet but decisive entry of China and Russia into a crisis Washington assumed it could manage with a few sanctions and stern warnings. The mainstream media has framed this as a local territorial dispute with a dash of Cold War nostalgia. That's dangerously incomplete. What's really happening is the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its will in Latin America, or whether the multipolar world has finally arrived at its doorstep. Let me walk you through what they're not telling you. The official dispute over dirt and oil. Here's the story you've probably Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has escalated its long-standing claim to the Essequibo region, a territory that makes up 2/3 of Guyana's landmass but has been under Guyanese control since an 1899 arbitration award. The trigger? ExxonMobil's 2015 discovery of massive offshore oil reserves in Guyana's waters, reserves that, by some estimates, could make Guyana the world's 4th largest oil producer by the end of the decade. Venezuela, mired in economic collapse and international isolation, saw an opportunity. In December 2023, Maduro held a referendum where Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to reclaim Essequibo, and he followed up by creating a new state, Guayana Essequiba, complete with a governor and military command. The July 31 incident was the next logical. Venezuela's Navy, acting on Maduro's orders, intercepted the MV Wolf, a vessel conducting seismic surveys for Exxon under a Guyanese license. The official Venezuelan statement called it a defense of our maritime sovereignty, while Guyana, backed by the US, condemned it as piracy. The US Southern Command immediately announced joint military exercises with Guyana, and the State Department issued a statement reaffirming its ironclad support for Guyana's territorial integrity. Case closed, right? A rogue state overreaching, the US stepping in to restore order, and the rule of law prevailing. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes this is just about Venezuela and Guyana. It assumes Maduro is acting alone. And it assumes the US response is purely defensive. None of those things are true. The hidden what's really going on. Let's start with the most glaring. Venezuela isn't acting unilaterally. The timing of this crisis isn't random. In the weeks leading up to the Sea Wolf incident, Maduro made 2 high-profile trips, one to Beijing, where he secured a $5 billion investment package, and another to Moscow, where he met with Vladimir Putin and emerged with a promise of unwavering support for Venezuela's legitimate territorial claims. Now, I've studied enough Kremlin playbooks to recognize the pattern. Russia doesn't back losing causes, it backs leverage. And Venezuela, with the world's largest proven oil reserves in a location that straddles the Caribbean's most critical shipping lanes, is the perfect pressure point against the US. Then there's the oil. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about land, it's about who controls the future of global energy. Guyana's offshore fields are some of the most lucrative in the world, with production costs as low as $35 per barrel. For comparison, US shale averages around $50. China, which has been quietly buying up Guyanese oil futures, sees this as a way to reduce its dependence on Middle Eastern supply chains. Russia, meanwhile, has a vested interest in keeping oil prices high. Every barrel Guyana produces is a barrel that doesn't come from US allies. And Venezuela? It's not just claiming Essequibo out of nationalist pride. It's doing it because its own oil industry is in freefall, and Maduro needs a lifeline. Here's where it gets interesting. The US knew this was coming. Declassified intelligence reports from early 2024 show that American agencies had intercepted communications between Venezuelan and Russian military officials discussing joint maritime patrols in the Essequibo region. The Pentagon even wargamed a scenario where Venezuela, with Russian backing, seized a Guyanese oil platform. The conclusion? The US had no good military options. A direct intervention would be politically toxic, especially in an election year. Sanctions? Venezuela's economy is already on life support. Diplomatic pressure? China and Russia would veto any UN Security Council resolution. So what did the US do? It doubled down on its support for Guyana, conducting military exercises and accelerating arms sales. But here's the Guyana's military is a joke. It has fewer active duty personnel than the New York Police Department. Its navy consists of a handful of patrol boats. Its air force? A single helicopter. The US is treating this like a Cold War proxy conflict, but Guyana isn't South Vietnam, it's a country with no capacity to defend itself. That means any real escalation would require direct American involvement. And that, my friends, is a slippery slope. The geopolitical how we got here. To understand why this matters, you have to out. The Essequibo crisis isn't just about Venezuela and Guyana, it's about the battle for the Western Hemisphere's future. For the past century, the US has treated Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine, the CIA-backed coups, the drug wars, all of it was predicated on one: no outside power gets a foothold in our backyard. But that world is gone. China is now the top trading partner for most of South America. Russia has re-established military ties with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And the US, distracted by wars in the Middle East and now Ukraine, has taken its eye off the ball. Let me be this as the first major test of whether the US can still enforce its will in Latin America. And so far, the results are not encouraging. China's play is economic. It's already invested $60 billion in Venezuela since 2007, most of it in oil for loans deals that have kept Maduro afloat. Now, it's positioning itself as the mediator in the Essequibo dispute, offering to facilitate dialogue while quietly ensuring that any resolution doesn't disrupt its access to Guyanese oil. Russia's play is military. It's not just selling Venezuela arms, it's helping Maduro build a parallel security apparatus, complete with Wagner Group-adjacent mercenaries and cyber warfare units. And Iran? It's providing drones and intelligence support, turning Venezuela into a forward operating base for its own regional ambitions. The US, meanwhile, is stuck in a 20th century mindset. It sees every crisis through the lens of containment, assuming that if it just applies enough pressure, the problem will go away. But that's not how great power competition works in 2024. The US is trying to maintain a unipolar world in a multipolar era. And in Latin America, the multipolarists are winning. Military: the nightmare scenario. Now, let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get dangerous. The US has responded to the Essequibo crisis with a series of escalatory joint military exercises with Guyana, including the deployment of F-16s and a Navy destroyer to the region. Accelerated arms sales to Guyana, including coastal radar systems and anti-ship missiles. A new Caribbean security initiative aimed at countering malign influence from Russia and China. On paper, this looks like deterrence. In reality, it's a recipe for miscalculation. Here's the: Venezuela's military is weak, but it's not powerless. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, which could shoot down a US or Guyanese aircraft. It has Iranian-made drones that could target oil infrastructure. And it has a navy that, while outdated, could still harass shipping in the Caribbean. More importantly, Venezuela has nothing to lose. Maduro is a dictator with no domestic legitimacy. His only path to survival is to create an external enemy, and the US is playing right into his hands. Let me tell you something I've learned from studying conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern: weak regimes are the most dangerous. They don't have the luxury of caution. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, it wasn't because he thought he could win, it was because he thought he had to. When Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, it wasn't because he was confident in victory, it was because he feared irrelevance. Maduro is in the same position. He's not going to back down. And if the US keeps ratcheting up the pressure, he's going to lash out. The nightmare scenario? A Venezuelan attack on a Guyanese oil platform, followed by a US airstrike in retaliation. Suddenly, you've got American troops in a shooting war with a Russian-backed regime. And then what? Do you invade? Do you occupy? Do you risk a quagmire in a country that makes Afghanistan look like a walk in the park? I've seen this movie before. It doesn't end well. The domestic political why this is happening now. Here's something else the media isn't talking: this crisis is happening in an election year, and that's no coincidence. Let's start with Florida. The state is home to over 1 million Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime. They're a critical voting bloc, and both parties are desperate to win them over. For the Biden administration, taking a hard line on Venezuela is a way to peel off some of those votes from Trump. For Republicans, it's an opportunity to paint Biden as weak on national security. But there's a deeper dynamic at play. The U.S. foreign policy establishment is addicted to crisis. For decades, American power has been sustained by the idea that the U.S. is the indispensable nation, the only country that can keep the world from descending into chaos. That narrative requires constant proof. You need a new enemy every few years. The Soviets, Saddam, Al-Qaeda, Putin. Now, it's Maduro's turn. The problem? This isn't a crisis that lends itself to easy solutions. The US can't invade Venezuela, it's already tried that with the Bay of Pigs, and look how that turned out. It can't rely on sanctions, they've been in place for years, and Maduro is still in power. It can't count on regional allies, most Latin American countries are too busy dealing with their own crises to get involved. And it can't ignore the fact that China and Russia are now deeply embedded in the region. So what's the play? Escalate just enough to look tough, but not enough to actually solve the problem. That's the sweet spot for American foreign policy in 2024. It's not about winning. It's about managing perceptions. Scenario: how this ends. Let me lay out the 3 most likely scenarios for how this plays out. None of them are good. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a tense stalemate. The US keeps conducting military exercises with Guyana, Venezuela keeps harassing oil vessels, and both sides engage in a low-level proxy war. China and Russia provide just enough support to keep Maduro afloat, but not enough to trigger a direct US intervention. The result? A frozen conflict that drags on for years, with Guyana's oil industry constantly under threat and the US stuck in a costly, open-ended commitment. Scenario 2, the limited war. This is the nightmare scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by Russian and Chinese backing, launches a limited attack on a Guyanese oil platform or military outpost. The US responds with airstrikes, and suddenly you've got American pilots bombing Venezuelan targets. Maduro declares a state of emergency, Russia sends military advisors, and China calls for an emergency UN Security Council meeting. The US finds itself in a shooting war with a nuclear-armed patron's-client state all over a territory most Americans couldn't find on a map. Scenario 3, the Great Power Showdown. This is the least likely but most dangerous scenario. In this version, the US decides to go all in, imposing a naval blockade on Venezuela or even launching a limited invasion to restore democracy. Russia responds by sending Wagner Group mercenaries or even its own troops under the guise of peacekeeping. China, meanwhile, uses the crisis as an excuse to accelerate its military presence in the region, perhaps even establishing a base in Venezuela. Suddenly, you've got a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0, except this time, the missiles are in America's backyard. Now, I'm not saying any of these scenarios are inevitable. But I am saying that the US is sleepwalking into a crisis it doesn't fully understand. And the scariest part? No one in Washington seems to be asking the right questions. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Let me step back for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. The Essequibo crisis isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of grand strategy. For the past 3 decades, the US has operated under the assumption that it can maintain global dominance through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological hegemony. That's the essence of what scholars call liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can and should shape the world in its own image. The problem? It doesn't work. Look at a war of choice that destabilized the Middle East and cost trillions. 20 years of nation building that ended in humiliating retreat. A humanitarian intervention that turned into a failed state. A proxy war that has drained US resources without a clear path to victory. And now, Venezuela. Another crisis, another opportunity for the US to overreach, another chance to prove that it no longer understands how power works in the 21st century. Here's the hard: the US is trying to maintain a unipolar world in a multipolar era. It's like trying to hold back the tide with a broom. China and Russia aren't going to disappear. They're not going to accept American dominance. And they're not going to play by the rules of a game the US designed to win. The Essequibo crisis is just the latest example of this dynamic. The US sees a problem, Venezuela threatening Guyana, and it reaches for the same old sanctions, military exercises, diplomatic pressure. But those tools don't work anymore. Venezuela isn't isolated, it's got China and Russia behind it. Guyana isn't a helpless victim, it's a pawn in a much larger game. And the US? It's a superpower with a shrinking attention span and an addiction to short-term thinking. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? If the US can't solve this crisis with military force or economic coercion, what can it do? Let me offer a few ideas, controversial, but necessary. First, stop treating Latin America like a backyard. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. The US needs to accept that it no longer has a monopoly on influence in the region. That means engaging with China and Russia as partners in regional stability, not as adversaries to be contained. It means working with Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina to create a Latin American security architecture that doesn't rely on US dominance. Second, use economic statecraft, not military force. The US has far more leverage over Venezuela through oil markets than it does through airstrikes. Right now, Venezuela is selling its oil to China at a discount, but it's still dependent on US refineries to process its heavy crude. The US should offer Maduro a lift sanctions in exchange for a freeze on Essequibo claims and a commitment to free elections. It's not perfect, but it's better than war. Third, stop outsourcing regional security to Guyana. Guyana is a tiny country with no military capacity. The US is setting it up to fail by encouraging it to stand up to Venezuela. Instead, the US should work with the Caribbean community to create a regional mediation framework. The goal shouldn't be to win the Essequibo dispute, it should be to manage it. Fourth, prepare for the worst. If Venezuela does attack Guyana, the US needs a plan that doesn't involve boots on the ground. That means cyber operations to disrupt Venezuelan oil exports, targeted sanctions on Maduro's inner circle, and a diplomatic full-court press to isolate Venezuela internationally. It also means being honest with the American people about the costs and risks of intervention. The bottom: this is bigger than Venezuela. Let me leave you with the Essequibo crisis isn't just about a disputed territory. It's about the end of an era. For the past 30 years, the US has acted as if it could shape the world in its own image. It can't. The unipolar moment is over. China and Russia are here to stay. And the US is going to have to learn to live in a world where power is no longer concentrated in Washington but diffused across Beijing, Moscow, and even regional capitals like Brasilia and Caracas. The Essequibo dispute is just the first real test of whether the US can adapt to this new reality or whether it will keep stumbling into the same old traps, mistaking muscle for strategy and presence for control. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's gamble wasn't just about oil or territory. It was about signaling. Maduro isn't just a desperate autocrat clinging to power, he's a man who understands that in today's geopolitical marketplace, weakness is the only true sin. By mobilizing troops and holding a referendum on Essequibo, he wasn't just testing Guyana, he was testing the United States. And the fact that the US responded with joint military exercises with Guyana in December 2023, followed by a flurry of high-level visits from Secretary of State Blinken and Southern Command officials, told Maduro everything he needed to. America still sees Latin America as its sphere of influence, and it will react when provoked. That's exactly what he wanted. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro played the US like a fiddle. He knew that Washington couldn't ignore a direct challenge to its regional dominance, especially not with China and Russia watching. So he forced the US to choose between two bad: either back down and look weak, or double down and risk escalation. The Biden administration chose the latter, sending a clear message that it would defend Guyana's sovereignty, but at what cost? The more the US commits to Guyana, the more it incentivizes Venezuela to dig in. And the more Venezuela digs in, the more it becomes a proxy battleground for great power competition. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate crisis. The Essequibo dispute is a microcosm of a much larger shift in how wars are fought in the 21st century. We're not talking about tanks rolling across borders or aircraft carriers steaming into the Caribbean. We're talking about gray zone warfare, where the lines between peace and conflict are blurred, where economic coercion, cyber attacks, and disinformation campaigns do the work of traditional armies. Venezuela's referendum wasn't just a political stunt, it was a form of lawfare, an attempt to legitimize its claims through the veneer of democratic process. And it worked, at least in the court of public opinion within Venezuela. But here's where things get really interesting. Venezuela's military isn't what it used to be. Decades of corruption, brain drain, and US sanctions have hollowed out its armed forces. The Russian Su-30s and Chinese radars Venezuela bought in the 2000s are now aging relics, and its navy is a shadow of its former self. So when Maduro talks about defending Essequibo, he's not actually planning a full-scale invasion. What he's really doing is creating a narrative of resistance, one that allows him to rally domestic support, distract from economic collapse, and position Venezuela as a victim of US imperialism. The real military threat isn't a Venezuelan blitzkrieg into Georgetown. It's something far more: a slow-burn campaign of sabotage, cyber attacks, and proxy warfare. Imagine Venezuelan-backed hackers disrupting Guyana's oil infrastructure, or Maduro arming local militias in Essequibo to create a low-level insurgency. That's the kind of conflict the US isn't prepared for because it doesn't fit neatly into the Pentagon's playbook. The US military is built for conventional wars, not for countering hybrid threats in a region it has long taken for granted. And that brings me to the broader geopolitical stakes. China and Russia aren't just passive observers in this crisis, they're active enablers. China has been Venezuela's lifeline for years, buying its oil, extending loans, and providing diplomatic cover at the UN. Russia, meanwhile, has supplied weapons, sent Wagner Group mercenaries, and even floated the idea of a military base in Venezuela. Neither Beijing nor Moscow wants a war in South America, but they're more than happy to see the US tied down in a messy, expensive regional conflict. Every dollar and every diplomatic resource the US spends on Guyana is a dollar and a resource it can't spend on Taiwan or Ukraine. So what does this mean for US strategy? First, it means recognizing that the old tools of hegemony, military bases, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation no longer work the way they used to. Sanctions on Venezuela have been in place since 2017, and they've done nothing but push Maduro closer to China and Russia. The US needs to stop pretending that economic pressure alone will force regime change. Instead, it should focus on what it does, shaping the incentives of other actors. Take the oil market, for example. Venezuela's heavy crude is useless without US refineries, which is why Maduro has been so desperate to get sanctions lifted. The US could offer a phased sanctions relief package in exchange for concrete concessions, like a freeze on Essequibo claims and a commitment to free elections. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better than the current stalemate. And it would send a message to China and Russia that the US is still a player in the region, but on its own terms. Second, the US needs to stop outsourcing regional security to tiny countries like Guyana. Guyana's military is smaller than the NYPD, and its government is inexperienced in dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. The US should be working with Brazil, Colombia, and the Caribbean community to create a regional mediation framework, one that doesn't rely on American muscle. Brazil, in particular, has a vested interest in preventing a war on its northern border, and it has the diplomatic clout to broker a deal. The last thing the US should do is turn Guyana into a client state, because that's exactly what Maduro wants. Third, the US needs to prepare for the long game. This isn't a crisis that will be resolved in weeks or even months. It's going to drag on for years, and the US needs to be ready for a sustained campaign of gray zone warfare. That means investing in cyber defenses for Guyana's oil infrastructure, building up the capacity of regional allies to counter disinformation, and developing a sanctions strategy that targets Maduro's inner circle without punishing the Venezuelan people. But here's the hardest truth: the US needs to accept that it can't control everything. The unipolar moment is over, and the world is moving toward a multipolar order, whether Washington likes it or not. That doesn't mean the US is powerless, it means it needs to be smarter about how it uses its power. It means recognizing that China and Russia aren't going anywhere, and that the best way to counter them isn't through confrontation but through competition. It means understanding that Latin America is no longer America's backyard, but a region with its own agency, its own interests, and its own ambitions. The Essequibo crisis is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that the world is changing, and that the US can't keep playing by the old rules. The question is whether Washington is willing to adapt or whether it will keep sleepwalking into the next crisis, mistaking motion for progress and noise for strategy. Because if there's one thing we've learned from Venezuela's subgamble, it's that the cost of failure is only going to get higher. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's Essequibo gambit isn't just a foreign policy blunder, it's a domestic political Hail Mary that's already unraveling at the seams. Maduro's regime is caught in a classic authoritarian. The more it escalates abroad, the more it exposes its fragility at home. And the numbers don't lie. The December 3 referendum, which the government claimed saw 10.5 million voters approve annexing Essequibo, was a statistical impossibility. Venezuela's Electoral Council has a long history of fabricating turnout. Remember the 2018 presidential election, where they claimed 46% participation despite independent observers reporting less than 20%? This time, the opposition's parallel count suggested turnout was closer to 2.1 million, with many of those voters likely coerced by state employees or social program beneficiaries. The regime's own figures would require nearly every registered voter in the country to have cast a ballot, including in opposition strongholds where polling stations were empty. That's not just fraud, it's desperation. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's strategy hinges on two dangerous: first, that a manufactured external crisis can distract from Venezuela's economic collapse, and second, that the military will remain loyal if the situation escalates. Both are already showing cracks. The economic data is staggering. Venezuela's GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, inflation hit 280% in 2023 according to the IMF, and oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, has plummeted to 750,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million in 1998. The regime's response? Print more money, impose price controls, and blame economic warfare by the US. But here's the uncomfortable: after 25 years of Chavismo, Venezuela's problems are structural, not conspiratorial. The country's oil infrastructure is crumbling, its refineries are operating at 10% capacity, and PDVSA, the state oil company, is a shell of its former self, hollowed out by corruption and mismanagement. Even if Maduro somehow seized Essequibo's oil fields, Venezuela lacks the technical expertise and capital to exploit them. The fields are deepwater, requiring billions in investment and technology that only ExxonMobil, Chevron, or Chinese firms like CNOOC can provide. And none of those players are going to risk US sanctions to partner with a pariah state. The military's loyalty is even more precarious. Maduro has spent the last decade purging the armed forces of dissenters, promoting loyalists, and embedding Cuban intelligence officers to monitor potential coup plots. But the cracks are visible. In 2019, Air Force General Francisco Yanez defected to the opposition, calling Maduro a usurper. In 2020, a group of soldiers attempted a raid on a military base in Aragua State. And just last year, the U.S. indicted former Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez for drug trafficking, a sign that even the regime's inner circle isn't untouchable. The military's top brass may still back Maduro, but the rank and file are suffering. Soldiers' salaries are worth less than $10 a month in real terms, and food shortages in barracks are common. If Maduro orders a full-scale invasion of Guyana, he risks a mutiny. The last time Venezuela's military was deployed in a major external operation was the 1960s, during the brief border skirmish with Guyana over the same territory. Back then, the armed forces were professional and well-funded. Today, they're a shadow of that institution, riddled with corruption and low morale. Here's where the scenario projections get interesting. There are three plausible paths forward, each with its own risks for Maduro. The first is the controlled escalation playbook, think Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. Maduro could order limited incursions into Essequibo, perhaps seizing a border town or two, while avoiding a full-scale war. The goal would be to create a fait accompli, forcing Guyana to negotiate under duress. But this strategy has two fatal flaws. 1. Guyana's military is small but well-trained, and it's backed by US and British Special Forces advisors. A limited incursion could quickly spiral into a quagmire. 2. The international response would be swift. The US has already conducted joint military exercises with Guyana, and the UK has sent a warship to the region. Even Brazil, which has historically been cautious about antagonizing Venezuela, has deployed troops to its northern border. Maduro might be able to take a sliver of territory, but he'd lose any remaining diplomatic credibility, and with it, the chance of sanctions relief. The second path is the negotiated retreat. Maduro could back down, framing the Essequibo push as a defensive measure to protect Venezuela's sovereignty, then pivot to seeking concessions from the US and Europe. This is the most likely outcome, but it's also the most humiliating. The regime has already signaled it's open to talks. Maduro's foreign minister, Ivan Gil, recently met with Brazilian President Lula da Silva to discuss de-escalation. But here's the: any deal would require Maduro to make painful concessions, like allowing free and fair elections or releasing political prisoners. And that's a non-starter for a regime that has spent the last decade dismantling democracy. The last time Maduro negotiated with the opposition, in 2021, he walked away after securing sanctions relief, then arrested key opposition figures. The US and EU aren't naive, they know Maduro's playbook. If he wants sanctions lifted, he'll have to give up real power, and that's a risk he can't afford. The third path is the most of full-blown crisis spiral. Maduro, facing internal dissent and economic collapse, could double down on nationalism, ordering a large-scale military operation in Essequibo. This would be a catastrophic miscalculation. Guyana's oil reserves are now the most valuable in the Western Hemisphere, and the US has made it clear it will defend them. The 2022 National Defense Strategy explicitly lists the Western Hemisphere as a priority region, and the US Southern Command has been quietly extending its presence in Guyana and Suriname. A Venezuelan invasion would trigger a NATO-style Article 5 response from the US, not because Guyana is a treaty ally, but because the geopolitical stakes are too high. China and Russia would likely provide rhetorical support for Venezuela, but neither has the capacity or the willingness to intervene militarily. Beijing's priority is securing oil supplies, not starting a war with the US over a territory it doesn't control. And Moscow, already bogged down in Ukraine, can't afford another front. The real wild card is the Venezuelan people. For years, the regime has relied on repression and immigration to maintain control. Over 7 million Venezuelans, nearly a quarter of the population, have fled the country since 2015, creating a safety valve for dissent. But that exodus is slowing. The UN estimates that only 200,000 Venezuelans left in 2023, down from 1 million in 2018. The reason? The economies of Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, once havens for Venezuelan migrants, are now struggling, and xenophobia is rising. That means more discontent is staying inside Venezuela, and the regime knows it. The December 3 referendum wasn't just about Essequibo, it was a test of the opposition's strength. The fact that turnout was so low, despite the government's best efforts to mobilize voters, is a sign that Maduro's grip is weakening. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has been emboldened by her landslide victory in the October 2023 primary, where she won 92% of the vote. The regime has barred her from running in the 2024 presidential election, but her popularity is a ticking time bomb. If Maduro can't deliver economic relief or a foreign policy victory, he'll have to rely on brute force to stay in power, and that's a losing game. Here's the bottom: Venezuela's Essequibo gamble was never about territory. It was about survival. Maduro is a man with his back against the wall, and he's betting that a manufactured crisis can buy him time. But the clock is running out. The economy is in freefall, the military is restless, and the opposition is resurgent. The most likely outcome is a messy, protracted stalemate, one where Maduro backs down from a full-scale war but refuses to make real concessions, leaving Venezuela in a state of permanent crisis. The US and its allies need to prepare for that reality. That means strengthening Guyana's defenses, but also offering Maduro an off-ramp, one that doesn't reward his aggression but doesn't push him into a corner either. Because the alternative, a failed state with a nuclear-armed neighbor and a refugee crisis that could destabilize the entire region, is too dire to contemplate. The Essequibo crisis is a reminder that in geopolitics, desperation breeds miscalculation. Maduro's gamble may have bought him a few months, but it's also accelerated Venezuela's decline. The question now is whether the region and the world is ready for the fallout. Because one thing is, this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning.